Hi, welcome to Lunch at the Library. I'm Emily Rao. I'm the Vice President of the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association, and it is my pleasure to welcome our two speakers for today. But first, I'll just remind you that next month, same time, same place, on April 3rd, we will be hearing from Gail Blankenow, who wrote Journey to Freedom, Uncovering the Grayson Sisters' Escape from Nebraska Territory. And we just heard from her at our board meeting last month, and so I think you're in for a treat with that presentation on April 3rd. For today, we'll be hearing from the author and illustrator of Ted Kooser, More Than a Local Wonder. You can see they have books available here. So I'll just briefly introduce them and turn it over to the two of them. So the author is Carla Ketner, who is the owner and manager of Chapters Books and Gifts in Seward, Nebraska. She's a former elementary school teacher and instructor of college-level children's literature courses. Paula Wallace, the illustrator, is an artist and illustrator, spending most of her days in her studio at the Hot Shops Art Center in Omaha, Nebraska. She has helped many authors tell their stories with her illustrations and has written and illustrated her own books, including Choose Your Days, which was the Nebraska Children's Picture Book Award winner, and Mr. Reginald and the Bunnies. Please welcome Carla and Paula. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us here today. We're excited to talk about Ted Kooser, More Than a Local Wonder. It's always fun to share the story behind the book, and if we have time, we'll read the story to you in a little bit too. But first thing I'll do is just share a little bit about the inspiration for the book and why I wrote it, and then Paula will talk about the illustrations and her process and anything else about the illustration. So the book came out last October in 2023, but it's been a long time in the making, as most books are. The idea began, I've been writing picture books for quite a while, but this is my first published book. And I was at a point where I was trying to come up with a new idea for a book, a manuscript. And I was down in my basement at home, and my son walked through the room, and he asked me what I was doing. I said, I'm trying to come up with an idea for a book and figure out what to write about. And he said, well, you should write a book about Ted Kooser. And I stopped and thought, that's an amazing idea. Yes, I don't know why I didn't think about that, because Ted has been a personal friend for about 20 years now. As you heard, I own Chapters Books and Gifts, and Ted spoke at our grand opening at the store 20 years ago. And that's when I first got to know him. Coincidentally, and very fortunately for me, that was about 2 weeks after he was named the United States Poet Laureate. So we had a great grand opening at the store, sold out of books right away, and everybody got to know Ted and was introduced to the bookstore at the same time. So that was a great little bit of serendipity for me. And since then, Ted has been a frequent visitor at the bookstore. He comes in even when he doesn't have a book to sign or anything. But we've done almost all of his book release parties, and he releases quite a few books. So we've had at least one pretty much every year since we opened 20 years ago. So I know Ted pretty well. My son grew up knowing Ted as just another guy, and which I think is very cool that he is on a first-name basis with the United States Poet Laureate, Pulitzer Prize-winning poet. So Joel said, well, you should write this book about Ted. And I thought about the idea, and then I said, there's no way I can, as somebody who's never published a book, I can't write a book about a Pulitzer Prize winner or, poet laureate kind of person who really knows how to write, because I could never do him justice. But then I was in the store a couple weeks after that, and a mom came in looking for a biography of Ted Kooser for children because her daughter needed to do a school project. And I said, well, there isn't one. But in the back of my head, I said, not yet. So after that, I decided, well, I'll ask Ted and see what he says, because he probably doesn't want me to do it anyway. And he didn't say no. So I said, well, will you answer questions and tell me about your childhood and let me interview you? And he did. And so I interviewed him, I did some research, started writing the book, revised it many times with input from from various readers, and eventually got it to a point where I thought it was good enough to see if I could get it published. Ted read it, and he gave me a little bit of feedback. His wife Kathleen read it and said she cried, so that's a good sign too. I revised it and everything, and then sent it to a couple publishers, including the University of Nebraska Press, who publishes Ted's poetry and some of his books for adults. And they basically said, we don't do picture books, but we love Ted, so maybe we'll make an exception and see if we can figure out a way to work with you and get this thing published. And in the process, they asked me if I knew anybody who might illustrate the book if they did decide to publish it. And I knew of Paula from Nebraska Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators meetings, and we've had some of her books at my bookstore. So I immediately thought of her because I love the idea that we have a Nebraska author, a Nebraska artist, a Nebraska publisher, and a Nebraska subject for the book. So the press asked Paula if she would do it, and she graciously said yes and created the beautiful illustrations that are in the book now. And it kind of just came all together eventually, and now we have this beautiful book. Does anybody have any questions so far? Okay, I think I'll turn things over to Paula now and let her tell you about how she did the illustrations and anything else she wants to say.
So I'm Paula Wallace. I'm an artist. I've been making art for a very, very, very long time, and I love books. I love illustrations. I think that everyone needs picture books, particularly adults, because adults read them to children, and particularly in this time, we have so much information coming at us. Some of it we can focus on, and other things are just too overwhelming. We need things almost distilled so that we can focus on that. What I admired about Carla's story about Mr. Kooser was that it was a story not just for children to find inspiration in, but also for adults. And by using a picture book format, it allows the reader, tall or small, to be able to look at the subject, to look at the subject really in a realistic way, but also an abstract way, that there's a kind of magic in picture books. And you pair words and art to help you put that story in your head and in your heart. We had the manuscript to work with. Carla was still working on the editing portion of it, and she gave me additional material to look over as I started to think about how this book should look. And like Carla, it's a little daunting to think about doing something for someone who has done such an incredible service to Nebraska, to readers worldwide, and he's also an artist. So here we are trying to honor someone who's done this incredible work, and you feel like the mere mortal when you're trying to come up with something. So as I started to work on this, I thought about things that might have been a tool, the implement for the writer, particularly for Mr. Kooser. When he was a boy, unlike now, people use pencils a lot more often. And in my other work, pencils have showed up a lot in paintings or in other things because I think of it as this implement of creativity. So I knew that I wanted a pencil to become a part of the story. And also the scroll, that the scroll is an archetype, that it unfolds to tell an incredible story, but in its unfolding, it goes out into the world, but when you roll it back up, it's also been informed by the world. So how would I try to figure out how that might look? Actually, the very first illustration that I worked on ended up being the illustration on the cover. So some of you have a little square bookmark, and you might notice a slight difference. Maybe you won't be able to see it from your table, but also maybe I'll have Carla walk around with a copy of the book, and then you can see if you recognize a slight difference between the two images. We were at the point where it was ready to go to press. We had received the last proof, and Carla shared the cover and material with Mr. Kooser, and he said, "Oh, I really like it, but I didn't wear glasses when I was at that age." Well, shoot, what were we going to do? So the folks at the press said, "Oh, well, we'll Photoshop it out." But I had my doubts. And when they sent a Photoshopped image to Carla and she shared it with me, I thought we were both going to cry because it really looked like, he had like googly eyes. It just didn't look right. And I said, I will work on it. Gratefully, where my studio is in the Hot Shops, there is a man, Terry Koopman, who is what I call a photographer's photographer. And he scanned in all the work or photographed it, cleaned the files and sent them to the press. So I sat with Terry for hours. We worked on trying to get it right for the book cover. So we got rid of Mr. Kooser's glasses. And the cover, came out with him more appropriately attired for the age in which he was represented. But that was one of those last-minute author illustrator nightmares because it's like, oh my God, we're ruined. But I'm also very grateful that while working on the illustrations, I sent several to Mr. Kooser to get some feedback. Because as an artist, I can create all kinds of things. And many things that I make, a painting or something for a gallery, it isn't quite as reined in by reality or reined in by an aesthetic or a quality of the subject that is important to capture. For me, it was really important that the images capture that part of writing, that part of creativity that is transcendent. That we have a lot in our physical world, but what we respond to in art, what we respond to in illustration, and what we respond to with words is something that we take in, like the scroll, it comes in, and we process it. But we don't want it to be base. It's not something that I want, certainly, or Carla, to be less than a higher quality, less than transcendent. So we wanted the books, the book, the words, the book, the images, to be transcendent, to tap into that magic, to tap into the wonder of writing. And I think for all of you, if I could see a raise of hands, how many of you have read Mr. Kooser's writing? So you know that he captures something. He has a way of looking at the world that is very special. So for us to take on that challenge of trying to walk in those footsteps means that we have to work a little harder and pay a little more attention to what we're doing. And we get to celebrate it now in Carla's book. And being able to read Mr. Kooser's poetry, to celebrate a wonderful human being, and to be inspired by that call to create, that he found his superpower in writing. And maybe this book will inspire the reader, tall or small, to find their superpower in writing or in making art. But that each of you, whether you've discovered it yet or not, you have a superpower and you're called to create. Any questions?
What is your normal medium, or what kinds of things do you normally paint?
Normally, I work primarily in oil, but I also work in watercolor. So some books, some illustrations, I think the watercolor is something more immediate. It's not as forgiving as oil, because if you make a mistake, and I used ink tints, which is like a watercolor, but it's a much more saturated pigment, and it will permeate the paper. So unlike watercolor, I can't kind of wash it away. If I make a mistake, I just set it on fire. But there's also that immediacy. And I think, particularly for children, they respond to different images in a different way, depending on how it relates to the story. The weight of the line. Some stories call for a heavier line or a greater saturation of color. Others are more ethereal. So I elected to work with a water media on this.
Do you do illustrations, or what other kinds of subject matter?
Oh,
do you just
I am
paint?
just a jack of all trades. I mean, what I like to say is whatever pays the rent. So I have gallery work. I have oil paintings, a lot of landscapes, but I've done portraits, and then I have whimsical things. I have lots of birds. So if you ever go out like to the Crane Trust in Alba, especially now during the migration season, I have artwork out there along with a number of other Nebraska artists. So a lot of bird imagery, some sky imagery. We also have our books out there. I have work in galleries, so Anderson O'Brien in Omaha. I have work in a little gallery in Italy. I have shown my work, in a variety of settings. So one example would be through an organization called ECVA, which is the Episcopal Church in the Visual Arts. And I've done a whole series on the Stations of the Cross, on the Passion. And those were prints, those were monotypes, and I wrote for those. I have a show coming up at the Nebraska Arts Council with Gretchen Peters from Nebraska, another Nebraska artist. And she is somebody who zeroes in on detail, colored pencil. So she'll have things really close, where I'll have things that are far away, sort of a near and far show. Great vistas. Even though my paintings might be smaller than her colored pencil drawings, she's focused on a detail, and I'm on the broad space. So I do a little bit of everything.
I'm not sure if this is for one or both of you, but what's the time frame from beginning of when you started interviewing and researching to when you opened that box of books?
A long time. Gosh, I mean, even if you go the traditional route, or if you're doing it yourself, if you're an indie publisher, generally, I was told this years ago, generally the average amount of time for manuscript to printed book would be 2 years. Sometimes it's faster, sometimes it doesn't necessarily take into the account of all the time preceding Carla's first starting to write, and in some cases all the time that was you put into trying to figure out what it looks like inside. That you try to get them to kind of coincide. Having a manuscript from an illustration point of view, having a manuscript helps the process, speeds up the process. I finished a book for a woman, a pediatrician, on childhood diabetes, but the book is in Arabic. It's for children in the Middle East. She didn't have a story. She wanted me to do all of the illustrations before she wrote the story. So that was challenging. But Carla can speak to, from that writing perspective, I mean, what would you think it took you?
If I remember right, I interviewed Ted in 2019 and took about 2 years to write and revise the book before I even sent it to any publishers. So that was, 2019, and it came out in the fall of 2023. So 4 years, and there's only less than 1,000 words in the story. So you wouldn't think it would take that long to put it together. But I think sometimes when every word counts like that, it takes longer to figure out which words have to stay and which ones can go and things like that, and to make sure every word that's in there belongs there. So it took a while.
What was your background before you wrote this? And then will you tell us the storyline in the, I want one right now. But will you just give us an overview of the storyline?
We can, or we can read it if you want. Should we read it?
Read it.
So what was your background
Okay.
before?
Before I owned the bookstore, I was an elementary school teacher, and I have a PhD in early literacy. I've always loved children's picture books and novels for middle graders and young adults.
Not very qualified.
No, sorry. But, which is kind of why I opened the bookstore, because it was a way to combine my love of children's books and also to interact with kids on a regular basis too, because we have story times, we have summer camp and things like that. And also to get to know a lot of authors and to, over the years, have experiences that hopefully will help me now as a published author too. Did I answer your question? Okay, good. I don't know, what do you think the best way to do this is? Do I have to stay by the microphone? Yeah, okay. Well, I'll try to hold it up too, and maybe Paula can hold one up so everybody can see. But we'll read Ted Kooser, More Than a Local Wonder by Carla Ketner and Paula Wallace. And by the way, Paula said my book, but it's actually our book. It wouldn't be the book it is without these gorgeous illustrations. Ted Kooser, More Than a Local Wonder. And I love that she took some of Ted's poems, and that's what the little sketches are here to represent some of his poems. For Ted Kooser, of course. In the city of Lincoln, Nebraska, as the 1960s tumbled by, Ted Kooser turned an ordinary refrigerator box into something extraordinary. Out of that box soared a great blue heron, limped an old black dog, trailed a red fence with no meat on its bones. Ted sat in that box and wrote poem after poem after poem. And that's true, too. When he first started writing poetry, he lived in a tiny apartment and didn't have an office, so he found a refrigerator box in the alley and turned it into an office. He put his typewriter in there and just started working away. I read this to third graders this morning, and they got a kick out of that idea.
That's one of the reasons I fell in love with the book, the manuscript right away. When you visit the studio, or if you see some of the projects I've worked on, I use a lot of cardboard, especially with kids.
While the city slept, Ted painted with words, portraits of the places and people he loved. His molasses cookie-baking mother, hat-selling father, and sister Judy made their appearance. Even his neighbor, Mr. Posey, waddle floated down the dark streets of Ted's poems. Ted created visions of a man on a bridge and a house held up by trees, of his Uncle Tubby's magical recliner, his grandparents' white bungalow, and his granddaddy's Standard Oil station. But those poems began even longer ago, back when he was a wiry Iowa boy called Teddy. Teddy was not skilled at sports and didn't quite fit in, but he was determined to find his place in the world. I think we can all relate to not fitting in and wondering where our place in the world is. On summer days, while the other kids played ball, little Teddy gulped ice-cold knee-high grape soda in front of the filling station his granddaddy ran. Around him, the old farmers turned out tales, the way their old tractors turned over the rich, dark dirt. Teddy soaked in these stories. They grew inside him like seeds in the July heat and Iowa rains. And on summer evenings, while bullfrogs croaked and cicadas sang, Teddy perched on his grandparents' front porch, listening to yarns his aunts and uncles spun, of a curious cousin in a high-top buggy, of floating down the town of Osterduck's flooded streets in boats, and of a fierce naval battle on the nearby Turkey River. These were true stories, so they said, that wrapped around Teddy like a cozy quilt. One April, Teddy received a birthday present. He saw himself in that book, in a character named Lentil, a clever boy who found his way in a small Midwestern town. Recognize that book? Teddy wanted to be the hero of his own story, like Lentil. So one day, when the old men paused for breath, Teddy swallowed his soda and spun a wild tale of his own, of his adventures with a talking terrier named Joel. And I did not make up the name Joel either. It just worked out really well that my son, who inspired the story, is also named Joel. And this is Ted's favorite dog he's ever had. Teddy was finding his way. In grade school, he wrote his first poem. In high school, poems and stories flew from his pen. All the while, he soaked up the farmers' tales and took notes of their techniques. His aunts' and uncles' stories bloomed inside him like the iris in spring. Books filled the empty spaces in his soul and fired his imagination. Year after year, Ted worked long hours, but he always made time for writing. His aunts and uncles and friends, the gravel roads he walked, the dogs he loved, and the books he read, all worked their way into Ted's heart and mind, and back out through his stories and poems. People paid attention. Readers put on their glasses and soared with Ted's great blue heron. Ted's words touched their hearts and took them on their own journeys. One day, news got around that Ted had earned an outstanding honor. He was to become the official poet of America. The whole town squeezed into the bookstore to congratulate him. Guess what bookstore? "You just never know," said Ted that day. "You never can tell what will happen when a curious little boy finds stories in the people who surround him and learns to write poems, when he fills the empty spaces in his soul with his own words and finds..." What do you think he finds? Himself. And then we included an author's note, bibliography, and I love too that we were able to include some of Ted's poetry in the back. So, a few of the ones that are referenced in the story.
What hours is your store open?
I have bookmarks up here with the store information on it, but we're open 9 to 5:30 every day, except Friday, 9 to 5. Come in anytime. Any other questions? Yes.
Paula, two things. One, I know you've known Ted for a long time, but anything surprising that came out in your research when you were writing the book? And then two, if you could read that charming little one on the back cover, one of those little symbols in the inside about Santa.
Okay, so this poem that Ted wrote, this is his very first poem he ever wrote. "I love my dog, his padded paws. At Christmas, he's my Santa Claus." Surprising things about Ted. Yeah, that's a tough question. I guess I knew that family was important to him, but listening to him talk, you really get the sense that his family is the most important thing in his life, and he cherished his relationships with his parents and his grandparents and his aunts and uncles, and they basically are the source of where he is now and supported him as a young man and made him who he is. So I guess that would be, I knew he loved his family, but I didn't realize how important they were to shaping him. Yes?
What's your next book?
That depends on publishers mostly. No, I have several manuscripts written. Most of them are just in my computer and haven't been sent out yet. Hopefully someday in the near future I will find somebody who will publish some more of them.
It's always got to be ideas.
Yeah, there's lots of ideas in there. I do have an idea for another Nebraska biography too, of a woman pilot from Nebraska. So hopefully that one. Yeah. Hopefully that'll get, I don't know. I don't know if I can find anybody to publish it or not, but maybe someday.
Would it be for children?
Yeah. Yes.
Do you have kind of agreements or some kind of conversation started with schools in the area to get the book placed in libraries?
We have an idea about doing that, and I've talked with someone from I think she's in the Nebraska Department of Education. Since Nebraska history is a big part of the fourth grade curriculum, we'd like to be able to get the book into all the fourth grade classrooms in the state, but that's a big goal, and I don't have funding to do that yet, but if you got some ideas, we're open to that. And I know there are, like the Nebraska, I think the Library Commission, she puts out a list every year of recommended books for school libraries, and she put this on it last year. So, did you have an idea for us?
Just curious.
Okay. We're always open to ways to get it out there so kids can read it. Yes.
I'd like to buy a book for my third grade great-grandson. How do I do that?
Come up here after we're done talking, and we can help you. I did not plant that either, by the way. But yeah, we have books to sell today. Cash or credit card, either way. Mhm. I just read it with third graders this morning in Milford, which was very fun. Other questions?
Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
I just want to say, I know I never come up here and say much about myself, but I just wanted to say that while I am currently the curator for the Heritage Room downstairs on the 3rd floor, my background is actually in children's librarianship. And so picture books have a very big place in my heart. And I can't thank you enough for how you said that these are for readers tall and small, because picture books, while the target audience may be for children, what they really do is make stories accessible for all. And not only that, there's as much of a story in the words as there are the pictures, and they work together in tandem to tell the story. So I'm so glad we were able to get both the author and the illustrator in to talk about their work today, because they both work just as hard on it. So please join me in thanking them today. And on behalf of Lincoln City Libraries, the Heritage Room, and the Foundation and NLHA, I have a little something for both of you. You're welcome. And fun fact, so the NLHA that sponsors these programs, the first president was Mr. Ted Kooser. So we're all here today again because of him. So